The moment Senator Rand Paul opened his mouth to attack Jonathan Roumie, he thought he'd found an easy target. The 62-year-old Kentucky Republican had just called the 51-year-old Texas actor and social justice advocate inexperienced and unqualified in front of a packed committee room. What happened next left Paul completely speechless and turned Roumie into a viral sensation overnight. Before we dive into this incredible political showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive moments that are reshaping American politics. Trust me, you're going to want to see every second of how this young advocate absolutely destroyed a veteran senator with just one perfect response. Paul thought his decades in politics would intimidate this first-term representative. He was dead wrong. What Roumie pulled out next didn't just shut him down. It exposed everything wrong with his entire political career and left the room in stunned silence. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and why this moment mattered so much. Rand Paul represents everything people hate about career politicians. At 62, he's been in the Senate since 2011. But before that, he was a member of the House of Representatives and has made a career out of libertarian ideals and fiscal conservatism. Paul made his fortune with his family's medical practice before entering politics, building a substantial personal wealth. He's known for his aggressive libertarian stance and his habit of talking down to younger Democrats, especially women of color. Paul's political style is old-school intimidation. He uses his wealth, experience, and his air of superiority to make opponents feel small. He's particularly condescending toward newer members of Congress, often interrupting them during hearings and dismissing their concerns as naive or unrealistic. His supporters see him as a strong conservative voice, but his critics view him as a millionaire disconnected from regular Americans. What makes Paul particularly dangerous is his calculated approach to these confrontations. He doesn't just attack randomly. He picks his targets carefully, usually going after younger members who he thinks won't fight back effectively. He's perfected the art of the political put-down, using his experience and institutional knowledge to make newer members look foolish in front of cameras and their colleagues. Paul's wealth also plays a crucial role in his intimidation tactics. When you're worth over $200 million, it's easy to look down on people who actually had to work their way up from nothing. He's never had to worry about student loans, healthcare costs, or any of the financial struggles that most Americans face daily. This disconnect shows in his policy positions and his interactions with colleagues who represent working-class districts. His track record as a politician is particularly telling. During his time in office, he consistently prioritized tax breaks for wealthy individuals and corporations while cutting funding for education, healthcare, and social services. He's also overseen some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country, making it harder for working families and communities of color to participate in elections. On the other side sits Jonathan Roumie, and he represents everything that terrifies establishment politicians like Paul. At just 51, Roumie is an advocate who came to Washington with one mission: to shake things up. Before entering politics, Roumie was a well-known actor and civil rights advocate, spending years fighting for working families in marginalized communities. But here's what Paul didn't understand about Roumie. He's not some naive newcomer who's going to be intimidated by his wealth or his title. He's a skilled communicator who spent his entire career going up against powerful people who underestimated him. He's quick-witted, fearless, and has zero tolerance for condescending behavior from anyone, regardless of their political seniority. Roumie's background is the exact opposite of Paul's privileged upbringing. He grew up in a working-class family in Texas, where his mother worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. He earned his way through college and law school, and every opportunity he's had to fight for. As an advocate for social justice, Roumie specialized in cases involving workplace discrimination and police misconduct. He spent years representing clients who had been dismissed, ignored, or intimidated by powerful institutions. This experience taught him how to research thoroughly, present facts clearly, and never back down from a fight, no matter how powerful his opponent might be. What makes Roumie particularly effective is his combination of legal instincts and public speaking ability. He knows how to build a case methodically, present evidence persuasively, and deliver devastating rebuttals. But he also knows how to communicate in a way that connects with regular people, avoiding the legal jargon that can make lawyers sound disconnected from everyday concerns. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just these two individuals. This was about whether the old guard could continue to silence and dismissed the new generation of diverse leaders in Congress. It was about respect, representation, and who gets to have a voice in American politics. Paul walked into that committee room thinking he could embarrass Roumie and score easy political points with his base. Instead, he was about to learn a lesson about underestimating people, a lesson that would go viral and damage his reputation for months to come. The setting was a high-stakes committee hearing on economic policy, with cameras rolling and political reporters watching every exchange. The committee room itself was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only in the gallery, as staffers, lobbyists, and journalists crowded in to witness what many expected to be routine policy discussions. What nobody anticipated was that this ordinary Tuesday morning hearing would become the stage for one of the most dramatic political confrontations in recent congressional history. The atmosphere was already tense due to the controversial nature of the economic policies being discussed, with billions of dollars in federal spending hanging in the balance. Paul had been questioning witnesses all morning with his typical aggressive style, but when Roumie's turn came to speak, he made the fatal mistake of interrupting Roumie's opening statement. What made this particular moment so explosive was the timing. Roumie had been building momentum with his colleagues and gaining respect for his thoughtful policy positions, while Paul had been increasingly frustrated by the attention Roumie was receiving from both the media and fellow Democrats. The irony was palpable. Here was a man worth over $200 million who had never had to worry about the economic struggles facing ordinary Americans, attempting to silence a man who had grown up experiencing those struggles firsthand. The visual contrast was stark. Paul in his expensive suit sitting comfortably in his senatorial chair versus Roumie, who despite his professional attire clearly represented the working families he was advocating for. Behind the scenes, Roumie's staff had actually warned him that Paul might try something like this. His communications director had briefed him on Paul's pattern of targeting younger Democratic leaders, and they had prepared talking points about his record just in case. But even they didn't anticipate how perfectly Paul would walk into the trap they had set. The committee hearing was being broadcast live on multiple platforms, ensuring that millions of Americans would witness this confrontation in real time. Social media managers from both parties were already stationed in the room, ready to clip and share the most compelling moments. What none of them expected was that they would be documenting the political destruction of a sitting U.S. senator. The tension in the committee room was already thick when Jonathan Roumie began his opening remarks about economic inequality. He had prepared detailed questions about how current policies were affecting working families in his Texas district, speaking with the passion and precision that had made him a rising star in the advocacy world. His opening statement was methodical and powerful. He talked about Maria, a single mother from his district who was working 3 jobs but still couldn't afford her insulin. He mentioned James, a veteran who couldn't find affordable housing despite his military service. These weren't just statistics to Roumie, they were real people whose lives were being affected by the policies being discussed in that very room. But Rand Paul couldn't help himself. Just 90 seconds into Roumie's statement, he cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Excuse me, Mr. Roumie," Paul interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think you might be confused about how these economic policies actually work. Maybe we should stick to questions you're qualified to ask." The room went silent. Several committee members looked up from their notes, surprised by the blatant disrespect. The Democratic members were visibly shocked. Interrupting a colleague's opening statement was considered a serious breach of congressional etiquette. Even some Republican members appeared uncomfortable with Paul's aggressive approach. Roumie paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at Paul, but instead of backing down, he smiled slightly, the kind of smile lawyers get when they know they're about to destroy someone in court. "I'm sorry, Senator Paul, I wasn't finished with my statement," Roumie replied calmly. "But since you seem eager to discuss qualifications, perhaps we can have that conversation." Paul, encouraged by what he mistook for difference, leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. This was exactly what he had been hoping for, a chance to put this upstart advocate in his place in front of the cameras. "Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm," Paul continued, his tone becoming even more patronizing. "But I've been dealing with economic policy since you were probably in high school. Maybe we should let the adults handle the complex questions." The comment drew audible gasps from several people in the gallery. The suggestion that Roumie wasn't an adult capable of handling complex policy was not just condescending, it was loaded with racial and gender implications that everyone in the room understood immediately. That's when the murmurs started. Committee members began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The Democratic members looked outraged, while even some Republicans appeared embarrassed by Paul's behavior. The cameras caught every reaction, every uncomfortable glance, every moment of growing tension. One Democratic committee member tried to intervene, saying, "Point of order, Mr. Chairman," but Paul waved him off, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. Roumie's response was measured but firm. "Senator Paul, I'm a sitting member of Congress, just like you. I was elected by nearly 200,000 voters who trust me to represent their interests. I don't need your permission to ask questions about policies that affect my constituents." But Paul was just getting started. He had clearly decided that this was his moment to put this young advocate in his place, and he doubled down on his attacks with even more venom. "Mr. Roumie, you've been in office for what, 8 months?" Paul continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I've been in public service for over a decade. I was a governor. I built businesses. I understand how the real world works. Maybe you should listen more and talk less until you've actually accomplished something." The audacity of the comment sent shockwaves through the room. Several Democratic members started to object loudly, but Roumie held up his hand, signaling that he could handle this himself. His composure was remarkable. While Paul was getting more agitated and condescending, Roumie remained calm and focused. What Paul didn't realize was that his aggressive approach was actually playing right into Roumie's hands. As a civil rights advocate, he had dealt with hostile opposing counsel countless times. He knew that when someone started attacking him personally instead of engaging with his arguments, it usually meant they were losing and getting desperate. "I appreciate your advice, Senator," Roumie said, his voice steady, but with an edge that suggested something big was coming. "And since you brought up accomplishments and real-world experience, I think that's an excellent topic for discussion." Paul, completely missing the warning signs, pressed forward with even more intensity. "Good, I'm glad you agree because, frankly, some of us have actually done the hard work of governing, not just giving speeches and posting on social media." The insult was clear and deliberate. Paul was essentially calling Roumie a social media politician, someone who was all talk and no substance. It was the kind of dismissive attack that older male politicians often used against younger women, particularly women of color, suggesting they hadn't earned their positions through merit, but were just benefiting from diversity initiatives or social media popularity. The attack also revealed Paul's complete misunderstanding of Roumie's background. Far from being a social media celebrity, he was an accomplished advocate with years of experience fighting for civil rights in some of the most challenging legal environments in the country. But Paul had just made a crucial mistake. He had shifted the conversation from policy to personal attacks, from substance to character assassination, and he had chosen to do it against someone who had spent years in courtrooms destroying people who underestimated him. Roumie's response was swift and surgical. "Senator Paul, since you want to discuss real-world experience and hard work, let's do that. Let's talk about what we've both actually accomplished." The room tensed. Even the Republican members could sense that something significant was about to happen. Paul, still oblivious to the trap he had walked into, gestured for him to continue, apparently confident that his resume would speak for itself. "I'd be happy to compare records," Paul said with a laugh that sounded forced. "I think the American people can judge for themselves who's actually delivered results." That's when Roumie reached for the folder he had brought to the hearing. What Paul didn't know was that Roumie had come prepared not just with questions about economic policy, but with a complete dossier on his political record, including some very uncomfortable facts that he had been saving for exactly this kind of moment. The folder itself had become legendary among Roumie's staff. Roumie's research team had spent weeks compiling information on every member of the committee, anticipating potential conflicts and preparing responses. They called it the accountability file, and it contained meticulously researched facts about each member's voting record, financial disclosures, and public statements. For Paul specifically, they had gathered information dating back to his business career, his time as governor, and his voting record in the Senate. They had cross-referenced his public statements with his actual policy positions, looking for contradictions and hypocrisies. They had analyzed his campaign finance reports to understand who was funding his political career. Most importantly, they had prepared specific verifiable facts that could be used to counter any personal attacks he might make. The thoroughness of this preparation reflected Roumie's legal background. As an advocate, he had learned that the key to winning difficult cases was not just passion or rhetoric, but meticulous preparation and ironclad evidence. He approached politics the same way he had approached his advocacy work, with exhaustive research and strategic thinking. The committee room fell completely silent as Roumie opened his folder. Even the staff members stopped typing. Everyone could sense that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The camera zoomed in on his hands as he flipped through the pages, and the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What made this moment even more dramatic was the contrast between the two politicians' preparation styles. Paul had clearly come to the hearing expecting to dominate through intimidation and his senatorial authority. He had prepared talking points about his experience and accomplishments, but he hadn't anticipated having to defend his record against a well-researched attack. Roumie, meanwhile, had prepared for war. He had anticipated that someone might try to attack his credibility, and he had armed himself with the weapons he would need to fight back effectively. The folder in his hands represented hours of research, strategic planning, and careful preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. What happened next will go down as one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent congressional history. Jonathan Roumie didn't just respond to Rand Paul's insults. He systematically dismantled his entire political legacy with surgical precision. Senator Paul, since you brought up accomplishments and real-world experience, Roumie began, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had done his homework. Let's examine your record of actually delivering for the American people. Paul leaned back confidently, still not realizing the danger he was in. He had built his political career on his business success and his tenure as Kentucky senator, and he was certain that his resume would dwarf that of a first-term advocate. I'm happy to discuss my record, Paul replied with a smirk. I think it speaks for itself. That's when Roumie delivered the first blow. Your record as governor of Kentucky, where you oversaw the largest healthcare fraud settlement in American history, he asked, his voice rising slightly. The company you founded, HCA Healthcare, paid $1.7 billion in fines for defrauding federal health programs. That's the real-world business experience you're referring to. The color drained from Paul's face. The healthcare fraud scandal was the most embarrassing episode of his business career, something he rarely discussed publicly and certainly didn't expect to be confronted with in a committee hearing about economic policy. But Roumie was just getting started. Or perhaps you're referring to your record as senator, where Kentucky consistently ranked at the bottom in per capita state spending on education, where teacher salaries fell far below the national average under your leadership. Roumie continued, reading directly from his notes. Is that the kind of real-world governing experience you think qualifies you to lecture me about serving constituents? Paul tried to interrupt, raising his hand and starting to speak, but Roumie had the floor and he wasn't finished. I'm not done, Senator, he said firmly, his legal training showing. You questioned my qualifications, so let's be thorough about this comparison. The committee chair, recognizing that something historic was happening, made no move to stop him. Even the Republican members seemed frozen, unsure how to respond to this methodical destruction of one of their colleagues. In my 8 months in Congress, Roumie continued, I've already passed more legislation benefiting working families than you did in your entire 8 years as senator. The Small Business Recovery Act, the Healthcare Worker Protection Act, all passed with bipartisan support because they actually help people instead of helping wealthy donors. Paul's face was now flushed red. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked around the room as if seeking help from his Republican colleagues, but they were all staring at their notes, unwilling to meet his eyes. But Roumie delivered the knockout punch with his next revelation. And Senator, since you mentioned social media and suggested I'm all talk and no action, I think it's worth noting that in the past year, you've tweeted 847 times about various political topics, while I've tweeted 312 times, usually about actual legislation I'm working on. So who exactly is the social media politician here? The precision of the number 847 tweets showed just how thoroughly Roumie had prepared for this moment. He hadn't just done his homework, he had built a complete case against Paul's credibility. Furthermore, he continued, your net worth increased by $40 million during your time as senator, while the median household income in Kentucky remains stagnant. So when you talk about understanding how the real world works, whose real world are you referring to? Because it certainly isn't the real world that my constituents live in. The room was completely silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and the low hum of the ventilation system. Paul sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, apparently unable to process what was happening to him. Roumie then delivered the final blow that would become the most quoted line of the entire exchange. Senator Paul, you came here today to embarrass me because you thought a middle-aged actor from Texas would be an easy target. You thought you could use your age, your wealth, and your position to make me look small. But here's what you failed to understand. I didn't come to Congress to be anyone's target. I came here to do the work. And unlike you, I've actually been doing it. She paused, letting the words sink in, then delivered the line that would be shared millions of times across social media within hours. So, with all due respect, Senator, maybe you should worry less about my qualifications and more about explaining to your constituents why you failed them so spectacularly. Because at this rate, this 51-year-old unqualified congressman is going to have a more impressive legislative record in one term than you've managed in your entire political career. The committee room erupted. Democratic members began applauding while Republican members sat in stunned silence. Paul himself looked like he had been physically struck, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking as he gripped his pen. But the most telling reaction came from the gallery, where reporters and staffers had stopped taking notes and were simply staring in amazement at what they had just witnessed. Several people were already pulling out their phones, knowing that they had just seen something that would be all over the internet within minutes. Paul tried to respond, stammering something about inappropriate behavior and disrespectful to a senior senator, but his words were barely audible and completely unconvincing. The damage was done, and everyone in the room knew it. The committee chair called for a brief recess, and as members began filing out, Roumie remained seated, calmly organizing his papers as if he had just finished asking a routine question about budget allocations. His composure was remarkable. He had just delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory, and he looked as calm as if he had been discussing the weather. Within 30 minutes of the committee hearing ending, Roumie destroys Paul was trending nationwide on social media. The video clips of his takedown were being shared faster than the platforms could count them, and political commentators across the spectrum were calling it one of the most masterful displays of political combat they had ever seen. The immediate reaction on social media was explosive. The most popular clip, Roumie's final statement about Paul worrying about his own record instead of his qualifications, was viewed over 2 million times in the first hour alone. The comment section was filled with fire emojis, applause emojis, and variations of "he ended him" and "that man has a family." Progressive accounts were having a field day. One popular tweet read, "Jonathan Roumie just gave a masterclass in how to handle condescending old men in politics. That was surgical." Another said, "Rand Paul thought he could bully a 51-year-old man from Texas and instead got absolutely destroyed on live television." You love to see it, but the reaction wasn't limited to predictable partisan responses. Even some conservative commentators had to acknowledge the skill of Roumie's response. A prominent right-leaning political analyst tweeted, "I disagree with Roumie's politics, but that was an absolute clinic in political communication." Paul walked into that one. The mainstream political media was equally impressed. Within hours, major news outlets were running stories with headlines like, "Freshman Advocate delivers devastating response to Senate Republican," and "Rand Paul's condescending comments backfire spectacularly." But the real impact was being felt in the halls of Congress itself. Democratic members were reaching out to Roumie's office to congratulate him, while Republican members were notably silent about the exchange. Several longtime political observers noted that they had never seen a freshman member of Congress command that level of respect and attention so quickly. For Rand Paul, the aftermath was nothing short of a political disaster. His office initially tried to control the damage by releasing a statement claiming that his comments had been taken out of context and that he had great respect for all his colleagues regardless of party. But the statement only made things worse, as it was immediately mocked on social media for its obvious attempt at damage control. The Florida newspapers that had generally supported Paul were notably critical of his performance. The largest paper in his home state ran an editorial titled "Senator Paul's Embarrassing Display," which noted that condescending behavior toward colleagues, regardless of their party or experience level, reflects poorly on Florida's representation in Washington. More damaging for Paul was the reaction from within his own party. Several Republican senators were privately expressing frustration that Paul's behavior had handed Democrats such an easy political victory. One anonymous GOP senator told reporters, "Rand stepped in it big time. There was no reason to go after him like that, and now we're all having to answer questions about it." The political implications extended far beyond just Paul's reputation. Roumie's performance instantly elevated his profile within the Democratic Party and among progressive activists. Within days, he was being invited to appear on major news programs, and his fundraising numbers spiked dramatically as small dollar donors flooded his campaign with contributions. But perhaps more importantly, the exchange highlighted the generational and cultural shift happening in American politics. Here was a 51-year-old man from Texas systematically dismantling a wealthy white senator from Kentucky using nothing but facts, preparation, and rhetorical skill. It was a perfect symbol of the changing demographics and power dynamics in American politics. The video clips continued to circulate for weeks, inspiring countless memes and reaction videos. The most popular meme format showed Paul's confident expression at the beginning of the exchange contrasted with his stunned face at the end, with captions like, "How it started versus how it ended," and "When you underestimate the wrong one." Roumie himself handled the sudden fame with characteristic grace and focus. In interviews following the viral moment, he consistently redirected attention from the personal drama to the policy issues he was trying to address. "I didn't come to Congress to have viral moments," he said in one interview. "I came here to pass legislation that helps working families. If standing up to bullies helps me do that more effectively, then so be it." His response to the attention also demonstrated the political savvy that had made his takedown so effective. Rather than gloating about his victory over Paul, he used the platform to highlight the issues he cared about most: healthcare access, education funding, and economic inequality. The long-term political impact of the exchange was significant for both politicians involved. For Roumie, it established him as a major voice in the Democratic Party and a formidable political force who could hold his own against anyone, regardless of their seniority or position. Progressive organizations began courting him for leadership roles, and his colleagues started seeking his advice on communication strategy. Within days of the exchange, Roumie's office was flooded with meeting requests from other Democratic members who wanted to learn his research and preparation techniques. His approach to opposition research became a model that other freshman members began copying. Several Democratic campaign committees reached out to his staff to understand how they had prepared for the confrontation so effectively. The demand for his expertise extended beyond Congress. Political consulting firms began reaching out to Roumie's team, hoping to learn from their research methodology. Law schools invited him to speak about the intersection of legal advocacy and political communication. The Harvard Kennedy School of Government asked him to participate in a case study about effective political messaging. His social media following exploded overnight, growing from 50,000 followers to over 800,000 in just 2 weeks. More importantly, his fundraising numbers skyrocketed as small dollar donors from across the country began contributing to his campaign. In the month following the exchange, he raised more money than he had in his entire previous quarter, with an average donation of just $27. The attention also translated into legislative success. Bills that Roumie had been struggling to get co-sponsors for suddenly attracted bipartisan support. His Healthcare Worker Protection Act, which had been stalled in committee for months, was fast-tracked for a floor vote after several moderate Republicans agreed to support it following his viral moment. For Paul, the damage was more lasting and multifaceted. The exchange became a defining moment of his Senate career, overshadowing many of his policy positions and legislative efforts. Political opponents in Kentucky began using clips of the exchange in campaign materials, and his approval ratings took a noticeable hit in the months following the incident. More troubling for Paul was the reaction within his own party. Several Republican senators were privately expressing frustration that his behavior had handed Democrats such an easy political victory. One anonymous GOP senator told reporters, "Rand stepped in it big time. There was no reason to go after him like that, and now we're all having to answer questions about it." The incident also affected Paul's committee assignments and leadership prospects within the Republican caucus. He had been considered for a leadership position in the upcoming Congress, but party leaders began having second thoughts about elevating someone who had become such a political liability. His fundraising also suffered as some major donors expressed concerns about his political judgment. Several Kentucky business leaders who had previously supported Paul began distancing themselves from him, worried that association with his confrontational style might hurt their own reputations. The impact on Paul's family life was also significant, though less publicly visible. His wife and children reportedly received criticism and negative attention on social media, forcing them to increase their security and limit their public appearances. The personal cost of the political confrontation extended far beyond Paul himself to affect his entire family. The broader implications for congressional culture were also significant. The exchange sparked conversations about respect, professionalism, and the persistent problem of senior male politicians condescending to their younger colleagues, particularly men of color. Several other freshman members of Congress, inspired by Roumie's example, began pushing back more forcefully against similar treatment. The incident became a case study in political communication programs and was cited in numerous articles about effective messaging and debate tactics. One particularly notable example occurred just 2 weeks after the Paul-Roumie exchange, when another veteran Republican senator attempted to interrupt a young Democratic congressman during a different committee hearing. Instead of backing down, the congressman immediately referenced Roumie's handling of Paul, saying, "I'm not going to let you Rand Paul me, Senator." The phrase became an instant meme and showed how quickly Roumie's approach had influenced congressional culture. Political analysts noted that the exchange perfectly captured the broader tensions in American politics between the old guard and the new generation of leaders. Paul represented the traditional model of political authority, wealth, experience, and institutional position. Roumie represented the new model: preparation, authenticity, and substantive accomplishment. The demographic implications were also significant. Here was a 51-year-old man from Texas systematically dismantling a wealthy white senator from Kentucky using nothing but facts, preparation, and rhetorical skill. For many viewers, especially young people and people of color, it was a powerful symbol of changing power dynamics in American society. The fact that Roumie's approach proved so much more effective sent a clear message about what voters were looking for in their representatives. They wanted leaders who could deliver results, not just talk about their past achievements or rely on their wealth and connections to intimidate opponents. Educational institutions began incorporating the exchange into their curricula as well. Law schools used it as an example of effective cross-examination techniques, while political science programs analyzed it as a case study in modern political communication. Communication professors noted how Roumie's calm demeanor and factual approach proved far more effective than Paul's aggressive intimidation tactics. The international reaction was also noteworthy. Political observers in other countries began discussing the exchange as an example of the changing face of American leadership. Several international news outlets ran features about Roumie, describing him as representative of a new generation of American politicians who were more diverse, better prepared, and less willing to accept traditional power structures. As the weeks passed and the initial excitement died down, the exchange continued to be referenced as an example of effective political communication. Communications professors used it as a teaching tool, and political consultants studied it to understand how to help their clients handle similar situations. The incident also had practical implications for how committee hearings were conducted. Several committee chairs began implementing stricter rules about interrupting colleagues during their allotted speaking time, and there was increased awareness about the importance of maintaining respectful discourse even during heated political debates. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the careers of the two politicians involved. Roumie used his newfound platform to push through several pieces of legislation and establish himself as a rising star in national politics. His committee assignments were upgraded, and he was invited to join several high-profile caucuses that typically only included more senior members. Paul, meanwhile, became more cautious in his interactions with colleagues and seemed to lose some of the aggressive confidence that had defined his political style. His staff began requiring him to prepare more thoroughly for committee hearings, and he was reportedly more careful about which battles he chose to fight publicly. The exchange also demonstrated the power of preparation and substance over bluster and intimidation. Roumie's success wasn't just about his quick wit or rhetorical skill. It was about the hours of research he had done to prepare for exactly this kind of confrontation. He had anticipated that someone might try to attack his credibility, and he had prepared devastating responses that turned those attacks into opportunities to highlight his opponent's weaknesses. This preparation extended beyond just knowing the facts about Paul's record. Roumie had also studied his previous public statements, his voting record, and his personal history to build a comprehensive picture of his vulnerabilities. When the moment came to respond, he was ready with specific, verifiable information that made his counterattack impossible to dismiss or deflect. The story of Rand Paul's attempted humiliation of Jonathan Roumie and his devastating response became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of the changing face of American politics and a reminder that in the age of social media and instant communication, Every political interaction has the potential to reshape careers and redefine public perception. For viewers